What's up guys, Johnny here with Team Legit, and today we're going to do the build video for the mini Drak. Now Chris Click definitely hit it out of the ballpark again with this aircraft. As you guys see those awesome videos from the full-size Drak, today we've got the little mini Drak and we're going to do a quick build video for you. I say quick because I feel like it's going to be a very fast build. So go ahead and strap in, grab your coffee, grab your kit, and let's get started. The first thing you want to do with your Drak, once you get it out of the foam packaging, is cut all the little nubs off. As you guys know, this is molded EPP, so this isn't just like a regular wing that you cut with a hot wire. This is injection molded into, a big giant mold, and they just shove the foam in there. So there's going to be little nubs of where all the foam gets inserted. You want to get a very sharp snap blade and just go through and cut off all the nubs. Now I've already gone ahead and done that on the wings. There's 2 up here in the back, in the front. And then we're going to take off the 4 that are on the actual aircraft. Alright guys, it ain't nubbin to cut off all these nubs. If you're a perfectionist like me, all you gotta do is take a good little sanding block and just get the fine little bits of those nubs down. Alright guys, before we move on to the next part of the build, we're going to do the hardest, what I would think would be the hardest and most difficult part, which is cutting out the motor mount. You're going to need 2 tools for this, which is again, sharp blade, and then also I have just a regular hacksaw blade. So what you want to do is you're going to see some grooves here on the sides of the motor mount. You're going to just take a flat blade and very carefully cut through all of this area about the size of the motor mount. Then you're going to take your hacksaw blade and very carefully go through and carve out. The good thing about the hacksaw blade is that it opens up enough of the foam for you to slide the motor mount in so the foam doesn't bulge or bubble when you press fit it down in there. So I've already gone through and cut this out with the hacksaw blade. So your motor mount should just simply slide right into the foam. And sit nice and flush. This process is very similar to what we do on our Legit wings, and it gets in there really nice and strong. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna take a popsicle stick and fill this entire cavity up with goop. I like to use Amazing Goop because when it's drying, it kind of sucks everything closer together. It kind of brings all the parts in. Another thing to note when you're building your Drak, again, I like to do things nice and perfectly. When these are stamped and cut out, there's little notches on the back of your motor mount. Now, it's not a big deal, but if you do have a bench grinder or a table grinder or even a Dremel, I like to smooth it out just a little bit. You can get Amazing Goop at most craft stores, Walmart. Heck, we even sell them. If you want to put a little goop on the mounting plate, you could, but if you got enough inside the cutout, you shouldn't really need it. We're going to go ahead and shove this guy in there. The great thing about goop is you get a little bit of time to play. So you've got room and you got a few seconds to make sure that your mount is mounted in there nice and flush and nice and even. And that looks pretty good to me. So what I'm gonna do is put some heavy weights on this, weigh it down so that when the goop dries, it sucks this thing shut. As you see, when I use the hacksaw blade, it didn't create any bulges or ripples. So I'm going to go ahead and load this down and let it sit for a couple hours. Alright guys, while we're waiting for the motor mount to dry, I'm going to take out my spar sleeves and I'm going to cut them to the right length so we can insert them into the wings, and then later we'll go ahead and place the one piece through the fuselage. First thing you want to do though is you want to make sure you remove the spar out of the sleeves. These are the joiner spars. You want to take these out. These spars do not get cut. However, the outside sleeves will get cut to fit each spar cap. Okay, so what I like to do is go ahead and stick the main spars in, tape them off where we're gonna go ahead and cut them, grab the opposite side, stick it in there, tape it off where I'm gonna cut it. Then move on to the rear spars, tape it off, and tape it off. Once you have your measurements, I suggest you go outside with a Dremel and a cutting wheel and go ahead and cut these spars. Don't use a pair of pliers or anything like that because you'll end up splitting the spars. So like I said, I like to take a Dremel with a grinding wheel and just cut them off. Make sure you guys have eye protection, and again, make sure this is done in a very highly well ventilated area because you're basically essentially just putting fiberglass into the air. It's not good to breathe. Okay, once you guys have the sleeves cut, you'll have center sections. We'll measure and cut these later. What I like to do is then take my spars with my sanding block, give them a light dusting, just so they get a good grip. Then we're going to take a wet paper towel and wipe all the carbon residue off. Okay, now they'll be ready to be glued into the wings. Before you stick the spars or do anything with the wings, make sure you go through it and make sure that it's nice and true, and take out any little bends. You can go ahead and form it if you need to. Just make sure that this leading edge and this trailing edge are nice and true, nice and straight. Sometimes during shipping they can kind of bend and flex and they'll hold that shape for a little while, but if you just go through it and give it a nice squid eyeball, right down the leading edge and the trailing edge, and just make sure they're nice and true. Because if you do glue these in, you're going to warp the wings and you don't want that. Alright guys, I'm back, and now we're going to go through and install our spar sleeves. I'm going to show you guys how to glue those in. Okay guys, so we've already gone through and cut our spar sleeves for our wings, and now I'm going to go ahead and trim down the spar sleeves for the main fuselage. As you guys will notice that they're going to be a little bit longer coming off the edges here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this on my bench grinder, and I'm going a little bit above and beyond, and just straighten out this edge, and then I'm going to go ahead and line it up and then chop off the excess that's going on here. Alright, as you see, I've just straightened out the edges of my spars. I'm going to go ahead and chop the rough ends here. Okay, great. Now that we've got these guys cut to the correct length, we're gonna go ahead and stick them in. What I like to do is use the rear wing joiner to help me keep it locked in place. So what I'll do is go ahead and stick this guy in there. We're gonna tack it in with some hot glue. Make sure the glue is nice and warm. And all I'm gonna do is put a light thin bead across each spot, and then I'm gonna use my spar joiner to push down on it. You don't wanna push down too hard, but you wanna make sure that this gets a nice solid catch. Make sure it's lined up. Now you want to make sure you've got nice solid catch, so we're going to hold that guy in there. A lot of your strength for the rear end of the fuselage is going to depend on this rear spar. So that's why I like to use the spar joiner. And I don't want to push down on it too hard as you see it flexes, but I do want to make sure that the spar gets seated nice and flush on the bottom of the wing. Make sure that's in there nice and flush. I'm going to go ahead and do the same for the front spar. Same thing, what I'm going to do with the wings, I'm going to put some hot glue in there. All I'm doing is a nice thin bead, nothing too crazy. Then I'm going to stick the spar sleeve in there. I'm going to use the top of the main spar to just kind of press fit it and make sure it's pushed down in there. Give it a second to dry. I'm going to do the same with the rear. All right, now we're going to do the other side. All Alright guys, once you got your main spars glued in, now what we're going to do is we're going to fill the cavity up with goop, and what you want the goop to do is settle in nice and flush, and it's going to seep down around the edges of the main spar, and it's going to give you that main stability, that main rigidity that holds the spar in place. Since these cavities are nice and tight, what I'm going to go ahead and do is I've got a goop applicator here, and I'm just going to cut it nice and wide. If you don't have the goop applicator, you can just use your finger or your hand or a popsicle stick, and just make sure you get the goop in there nice and secured. I'm going to start with the wings. Just a quick note guys, before you goop any of this stuff in, attach your aircraft with using the spars and just make sure everything fits and lines up nice and flush. And as you guys can see, as the goop starts to settle, it starts filling in the cavities and the edges of the spar, and it starts sinking itself in. You may want to put a little piece of tape on these edges so the goop doesn't spill over the edges. What I'm going to do is put a little cap or something on the edges here to keep the wings drying nice and level, because as you know, the wings have some sweep to them, so when they sit down like this, I don't want the goop to flow downhill. Alright, now we're going to do the main wing. If you guys are a neat freak like I am, you may want to tape the insides here just to keep the goop from seeping into the fuse. Alright, so I'm going to raise up this rear end here and let this goop dry nice and smooth in here. And let it fall into place and fill all those different cracks and crevices. Alright guys, now that we've got the spar sleeves glued into the fuselage and the wings, I'm going to go ahead and move on and start the sparring of this aircraft. Once you get the spar sleeves put in, what I like to do is flip the wings over and go ahead and open up the inside pockets of these spar sleeves. Just a quick brush with a hot soldering gun will open them up. You're going to have 8 spars in the complete build, which is going to be 2 full spars per wing and 4 spars for the actual fuselage. Now I'm going to start with the wings. So first thing I'm going to do is get my spars, and then I'm going to measure them to the right length. So each wing is going to require 2 spars. So now that we've got our spars, what I'm going to do first off is measure them. What I like to do is fit the spar in place. I'm going to tape this off right where I need to cut the first cut. But I'm not going to cut right there just yet. Next, I'm going to flip it around. And I know this guy is going to go to about here. Now, as you guys can see, these 2 lengths are not the same, but I do know that I'm going to have to cut here and I'm going to have to cut here. What I'm going to do actually is just cut this right in the middle of the 2. And the reason for that is so that I can put it in there and I have something to grip onto when I spin this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the rest of these and cut them the same length, which should give me some excess on each spar. Alright, so we should have 4 equally length spars for the top and the bottom. We're going to go back to our trusty goop. Again, if you're a neat freak like me, what you can do is tape all the spar channels so that when you fill it with the goop and you run it back and forth, you don't get any goop excess on the actual wing itself. So what I'm gonna do is go ahead and tape it off. If you guys can do this in a cleaner manner, you're more than welcome to. I tend to get a little overzealous with my goop. So then I can take my goop, fill it in here, take the corresponding spar, stick it in there, and have a little bit of room on the end to spin it to make sure that goop gets on the top and the bottom of that spar. All right, guys, I'm gonna put these off to the side to dry, and then we'll move on to the next step. Quick note, guys, when you're working with the tape and the goop, before the goop cures, so about 5 to 10 minutes after you apply it, you wanna go ahead and take the tape off. That way it doesn't actually stick to the airplane. Okay guys, now we're going to move on to the fuselage. There's a couple different ways to do the sparring on the fuselage. Chris recommends that you take a snap blade and a razor and you cut through this groove all the way down the spline, all the way to the end, and then you take your spar and you shove it in there and then hit it with some CA with kicker, and then if you want to put a little goop over it, you can. I'm going to go ahead and do one that way and do the other one with the CA method. The difference between the two is one is faster than the other. The goop doesn't have to dry as long with the CA method, and you get to sink the spars in there nice and deep. The other way is with the goop, which is what I'm more accustomed to and I like to do, but it takes a lot more time and it takes a lot more skill. So what you'll end up having to do is popping the spars in, tacking them with some hot glue on the edges and the curves, and then going over it with goop afterwards. So what Chris recommends you do is take your snap blade, make sure you get a nice fresh sharp snap blade. So we're gonna go down this seam right here. Then you're going to take a flat screwdriver and just kind of open up the EPP just to relax it a bit. Now you should be able to wedge the spar right into the foam. Takes a little bit of working, but once you get it wedged in there, you can just simply CA glue it down into place. I'm going to add a little bit extra. What I like to do is take a hot wire and my torch. This is just a control rod. Get it warmed up nice and hot. And pop little channels in the front. You don't have to do this. This is just something extra I like to do. So that way when I'm working the spars in, I can hot glue them into the front and they don't move around. And then now I can just drop them down into the aircraft. And as you can see, they go in with a little bit of work, but it looks really nice and clean after you're done with it. So I'm just going ahead and sticking them in here for now as a dry fit. So I've got some thick CA. It's better if you use thin just because it's a little more runny, but I'm just going to use the thick CA. All right, now that my hot glue gun is dry, I'm just going to go ahead and pump some hot glue in there and in here. And I'm going to shove the part where I cut into the hot glue just to give me that cleaner look. Okay. Now I'm going to take my CA glue and put a bead of CA glue down. Before this side completely dries with the hot glue. Gonna put another bead of CA glue. Again, guys, be careful. Make sure you do this outdoors or you do this in a very well ventilated area because this CA glue is vicious. So we're gonna go ahead and shove that down in there. And as you guys can see, it just sinks right in. Okay. All right, now that I've got it in there, I'm going to let the CA glue start to dry. I'm going to try to wipe off any spots where I didn't intend to get any of that CA glue. I'm going to make sure that my spars are shoved in nice and tight. And now we're going to lock in the freshness. Alright guys, I'm back on our build and you'll notice that the spars are all nice and dry. The top spars with the CA glue worked out really well. They're nice and sturdy. As you can see on the wing spars, there's a little bit of protrusions on the end. That's okay because I'm going to trim this after I'm done with sparring the bottom side. Now, moving on to the bottom side. So what I've done is taken the plug from another Drak that we built and I've just carved out the bottom of it to make my spar caps. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is glue in these spar caps, and I believe I'm going to go ahead and use goop. I think goop just seems to work the best. So what I'll do is I'll fill the top up with goop and slide the spar caps on top, and hopefully that goop seeps out the sides, and then I'll wipe that down. And the reason why we're talking about this now is before we proceed on sparring the bottom of the wings and the aircraft, we have to make a decision of how we're going to fill the gap. Alright, I'm going to give it about 45 minutes to an hour for this goop to start to set in and harden. Okay guys, moving on to the next step. While I'm waiting for the spar caps to dry, I'm just going to cut out the slots where the spars will need to go. Again, I'm going to use my hot wire and my torch. I'm going to heat up the tip of the rod and use that to carve the little indents of where the main spars are going to go. When you guys are doing this, please put your torch on a solid surface where it can't fall over and set something on fire. There was a build a while back. Timmy from our team was putting together an airplane and he had the torch on his table like this and he had bumped the table and the torch he caught it before it hit the table, but it touched a part of the EPP and it ruined the aircraft. So I suggest you guys put this guy on the floor. Alright, now you can see I've got it nice and glow hot. It's steaming over there. And we're going to take it very carefully. And lastly, while I've got the hot wire on, I'm just gonna make my channels for my front two spars. Alright guys, so we're back, and I've gone ahead a little bit in the build. Pretty much all I've done is went ahead and gooped in my bottom spars after my spar caps dried. And now I'm going to go through, chop off the ends. Then I'm going to go through and put the CA glue on the bottom half of my fuselage and then shove the spars in there. What I did do overnight was cut the spot for where the spars are going to go, and I shoved them in there, so I let them sit overnight to kind of relax the foam so it gets a nice fitting of where the spars are going to go. So what I'm going to do is just pop those out real quick, and then I'm going to fill this with CA glue and shove them back in. Alright, before I do that, I'm going to chop these off real quick, and same method, I'm just going to take the Dremel cutting tool and I'm just going to chop off the excess spars that are sticking out on the end of this wing. Alright, at this point our wings are completed. Alright, so now we can go through and take our CA glue, and I'm going to put a nice amount of the CA glue here in this groove. We're going to shove this guy right here into the nose, and then I'm going to go ahead and start popping them into the fuselage. And because I relaxed it the night before, you can see that it just fits in there. We're going to take the strawberry scented kicker, and that's it. Alright guys, now the aircraft is complete. I'm going to do a quick dry fit. So I'm going to insert the long spar here in the front of the aircraft and the short spars here in the back. Then you'll notice these little Kydex pieces. These little plastic Kydex pieces are here to add additional support for the vertical stabilizers, so the Coroplast doesn't get chewed up on those landings. It has more surface area. Simply pop in. Now it's important when you're doing a dry fit to use the vertical stabilizers because they will make the difference between the space of these long spars. Now it may be necessary to trim some of the main spars. If you see that it's not reaching all the way, it could be that the main spar is just a bit too long. And the way I like to check to see which one is too long is run them one at a time. So if you do need to trim it, what I've done here is I've stuck the spar into my main wing and I'm running it all the way to the very end here. Then I stick in my two verticals and I notice that the spar is just about a ½ an inch too long there. So I'm going to go ahead and remove it. I'm going to do the same thing with the rear spar. So as you can see, I've measured about ½ an inch, but I'm going to take that off of the end. It's not too much. Then we're going to go ahead and trim that. Now we can do another dry fit. And as you guys can see, we've got a nice snug fit with no gaps between the foam. Alright guys, we're back with the build. After you've done gluing all your spars and everything in, and you did your test fit and your dry fit, now would be a good time to apply some paint. We're going to get into the details about my paint job here in a second. Let's talk a little bit about paint. The first thing to note is this is EPP, so any kind of paint you use is going to be perfectly fine. It's not going to eat away at the foam. You don't have to worry about getting expensive foam safe paints or anything like that. Now, talking about that and using the expanded polypropylene like this aircraft is in a mold, paint doesn't like to stick to this aircraft very well. So the only kinds of paint that we found works really good is Plasti-dip. And I'll put description below where you can get those Plasti-dips. Most of the time you can just order on Amazon. They come in all kinds of different colors. So if you do want to paint it, I recommend using the Plasti-dip. What I did here with my aircraft is I actually had it hydro dipped at a hydro dipping company here in town. It's called True Zero Enterprises, and I'll go ahead and send you guys the link in the description as well. And to protect the coat, I went ahead and put a very light 3mm laminate. Now, by no means do you have to laminate your aircraft. This EPP is really strong, it's very durable, and it does not require laminate. The only reason I did it again is to lock in this fresh, amazing scale dragon style paint scheme. Now, one thing to note is along the trailing edge of this aircraft, you're going to have to stick the balsa elevons after they've been laminated. And talking about different paints and how they don't stick, the best thing to do is paint the trailing edge of this aircraft in black or whatever Plasti-dip colors you want. Let that fully dry. That way it has something to stick to. Because if you just apply tape to the back of this and pull it, that paint's going to rip right off. Now, another thing you could do if you don't want to paint the Plasti-dip on the trailing edge, you can go ahead and laminate the trailing edge. Laminate sticks to this foam very well. So once you got it laminated, now you have a perfect surface to add your control surfaces. So this aircraft is a pain in the butt to laminate. It's got a lot of curves and textures, and being molded EPP, that's what you got to expect. So if you choose to, you could just laminate the wings and leave the fuse bare, or laminate the whole aircraft. Again, by no means do you have to laminate. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go ahead and work on the control surfaces. Okay, included in your kit, you're going to get two elevons, two balsa elevons. One thing to note is you want to take your elevons and mark the top, mark the correct directions, because if you don't do it right, you're not going to get the most reflex and you're not going to get the best movement out of your elevons. So as you can see here, I've gone ahead and put an arrow here on the top showing that this is the top, and they're going to be the same, but when you cut them, there's going to be a left and a right. So I went ahead with the pen and I just wrote top. So you'll have, it almost looks like the shorter part of the elevon is the bottom and the top part is a little bit longer. Yeah. It almost looks like the bottom of this is beveled. But I'm going to get through and we're going to make this elevon look great here in a bit. As you can see, I've already went ahead and drawn my template down on this elevon here. There will be a PDF template that you can download. I'll also put that in the description below. What it'll be basically is two 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper that you tape together to give you where you need to cut the elevons. So I've already gone ahead and drawn that up. So what I'm going to do is cut this and then use this as my template for the other side. All right, the best way to cut these balsa elevons is a snap blade, and if you have a very fine saw blade, that also works great. What I like to do here is take my snap blades and score all of my cuts. If you use a sharp enough snap blade and you keep going over and over, you can get some pretty nice and precise cuts. So now we're going to cut the long seams. It's always good to just go very lightly over your lines. You don't have to dig too deep in. Just go very nice and light and try to keep your lines as precise as possible. Once you've done that, you can do it once or twice and then just apply more pressure each time. And eventually it'll come apart real nice. So now we're going to trim the inside here. So after you've cut the first one out, you can use that as a template for the second one. So you have to remember that we wrote top on this guy right here. So the way it would fit would be a complete inversion, would be just to flip this guy and line him up to the back here. And then trace it out. And then check it to make sure that it lines up. And as you can see here, mine looks like it lines up just fine. So what I'm going to go ahead and cut this out also with the razor blade. Alright guys, once you've gone ahead and cut your elevons in the correct pattern, you're going to notice there's some chunks and some chips and a couple flat edges and round corners. What I like to do is take the flat sanding block. This is a foam sanding block. I got it at Walmart, I believe. And then I like to go ahead and just start sanding it all down. One thing that helps keep these elevons nice and true and even is lining them up perfectly to each other. And remember, there's going to be a right and a left when you do this. So if you can see there on the camera, there's a right and a left. What I like to do is just make sure they're nice and tight and then just go through and sand them together. That way they get shaved down nice and evenly. I like to also roll the edges so that way everything is nice and smooth. So you can go ahead and roll all the straight edges of the elevons here. And I believe this is 120 grit sanding paper. You don't need very, very coarse. Actually, the finer, the more precise your sand is going to be. Another thing you can do too is if you put your finger right here at this valley, the little top of the apex right here, should be able to line them up, and you can make sure that they're about the same length as well too by doing this. If you have any kind of lip on one side or the other, just take your sanding block and sand it nice and down. Alright, so the outsides of my elevons are pretty nice. I'm just going to go ahead and give a nice soft sanding on the top sides here. This is the part where they were together when I was holding them down. So once we've got them all sanded down properly, another thing you could do if you like, and I like to do this on a lot of mine as well, this aircraft has the bevel already in the bottom here, which will give enough articulation of the elevon, but I also like to sand this down just a little bit more. So what you can do is take some sandpaper again and give this a nice rough sanding and round out the bottom here. And if you want to go a step further, you can take a razor blade and very carefully take off this corner here and give it a better bevel, and that way you have full articulation. However, you're not really going to need it that much because this aircraft does have just a little bit of reflex. So it will sit, and you should have some gap here on the bottom, right in here in this hinge where the hinge goes. But again, rounding off and tapering that down a little bit more will help. I don't sand this edge because I want it to be nice and straight when it connects to the back of the wing. So I don't really sand this part down because I don't like there to be any gaps. So I leave this top part of the elevon nice and flat, and then I'm going to go ahead and round down the bottom side. Alright, so our elevons are done. I'm going to go ahead and put a coat of paint on this, and we'll be right back and we'll start on our servos. Alright, so the servos that I use come in two different options. You could use the MG, the Metal Gear ones, and they're a little bit more durable and resilient for hanger rash and things like that. Or you can use the BB, the ball bearing ones, and those do just the same amount of work. However, they're not MG, they're Metal Gear. I don't think you're going to have a problem with torque issues on this aircraft because of the little amounts of throw that you need and also the size of the servos that are in the kit. Alright, before installing the servos, there's a little bit of prep work involved. These servos normally come with a round control horn. I went ahead and removed that. The one that I have on here goes across horizontally, so I've already cut that off and I've used my grinder to round off the bottom. So it's just a single-sided control horn. Also, as you can see, I went ahead and cut the little screw holes off because we don't need them to fit in our aircraft. So this servo is going to actually fit in here just like this. You don't need the excess parts, so what I like to do is just take a pair of dikes clip them off, and then I'm gonna go ahead and put this on my table grinder and just round this off and smooth it up a little bit so it fits in here nice and flush. All right, lastly, before we install this in here, I like to use a servo tester to make sure that my servos are centered. And as you can see hooked up to the servo tester, they're both facing vertical to get maximum throw forward and backwards. All right, so once that's done, now we need to prep the area. What I'm gonna do is get a control rod nice and hot, and as you see, this is used mostly for carving and digging into EPP. So I'm gonna get this nice and hot, and I'm gonna carve out the little channel from here to here of where the servo wire is going to come out of. And then I'm just gonna fill this with some hot glue and drop the servos in, hold them down nice and tight until they dry completely. All right, got it nice and glow hot. And as you notice, there's a little notch on the back of the servo. I want that to sit comfortably in there. So what I'm gonna do is carve out back here. And then we're gonna take our servo, feed it through, and do a test fit to make sure that everything fits. And as you can see, it's in there nice and snug. We've got enough movement to the front and the back. Next, what you want to do is take your fuselage and make sure you line it up here nice and tight. And then I'm going to score where the wire is going to fit through the fuse, and we're going to carve out that channel as well. All right, so we've carved out a nice hole for relief. And as you can see, this should line up nicely, and the wire goes all the way through to the main fuse. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that to the other side. As you can see, I've got all my lines ready for my servos. I've also put my ESC in place because I want to channel out the rest of the holes and do the rest of the plumbing for the aircraft. I'm going to be using the mini vector, so I want to go ahead and start placing my components in. And the reason why I'm doing that now is to see where I need to make all my holes for all my plumbing. All right, so let's go ahead and glue down our servos. Making sure to put enough hot glue in the cavity that holds the servo down, but not too much to where when I put the servo in and press down on it, that glue goes in and interferes with my control horn. All right, that seems like a good solid flush fit. So I'm going to hold that down for a second. Now we're going to go ahead and do the other side. All right, now we got our servos completely installed and ready to hook up. All right, guys, as you can see, my elevons are painted nicely. Now what we're gonna do is we're gonna go ahead and laminate these with the included laminate, and then I'm gonna show you guys how to attach them to the wing. All right, guys, moving on to the elevons. As you guys can see, I've got my elevons cut, sanded, and painted nicely here. And I've got some of that 5mm lam that came in my kit. And what I'm gonna do is just cut it down to size so I'm not playing with the whole piece. So what I like to do is find the top of your elevon, which this is the top of my left elevon, and put it facing down. And then I'll slide this back to right about here. So there's a little bit of the elevon exposed. I like to use that straight edge against the side here, and I'm just gonna chop this. Your life will be a lot easier if you guys use a fresh blade to cut the laminate. It just cuts a lot nicer. So now, as you see, if I line this up here, and then this goes over, it'll overlap nicely. I left quite a bit more because we're gonna trim the inside of these curves to get it to line up. So what I like to do is put the lamb on the leading edge of the elevon, giving myself a little bit of play room right here in the front, and we're gonna go ahead and tack that down. All right, and then what we're gonna do is we're gonna pull it. While I'm holding it tight here, as you see, I'm just gonna roll around that nice curved edge that we made earlier. Now, so we don't have to mess with all this excess, what I'm gonna do is just chop the edges off here. And then I'm gonna go ahead and cut the corners here and here, top corner. That way we can fold this over. I'm gonna trim this down. That way it's manageable, so when you flip it over the edge here, you've got plenty of space. Now, without applying too much pressure, you don't want to pull on it so you don't create any wrinkles. I'm just going to gently hold this and let the iron work over the corner of the top. And once I've got it over the edge here, then you're just going to slowly start to work it in. Again, don't pull on it because you don't want to create wrinkles. Now what I'm going to do is go right through to the middle and then start working my way out towards the edges. Now I can trim all the excess off. What I want to be able to do is fold this over the edge about halfway and then fold this down here. Now comes the fun part. We have to cut some relief for the edges. As you can see, there's a flat part here, then there's a flat part here to here, and then it rounds out here, and then it comes to here and here. So if you see where I'm cutting the relief, we got a relief there. So now you'll see that piece will go over flat right to there. Then we've got another edge right here, so that'll be flat there. Got another piece here, so that'll cover up there. This will cover up that section, and then we've got another relief that goes here. Another thing to note is if you see that the lamb that I have is quite a bit extra and it will go over the edge. I don't want it to go over the edge. All I want it to do is meet and touch the other side of the lamb with enough meat so that it grips nice and tight. So what I'm gonna do is trim my lamb right here and here, so when it reaches the other side, it's nice and flush. If you pull the lamb over and you notice any kind of creases, those are places that will need some relief as well. So same thing, let the iron do the work, rolling over the corners, rolling over the edges. And then just tack it down. A quick side note, if you guys have any spaces that have any wood visible and you'd like to tack them up, it's okay to take little pieces and just make patches. So the best way to do that is just place the piece over the area that's unexposed, tack it down, and then trim it to fit. All right guys, there you have it. Elevon is complete, nice and stout, really rigid, and ready to be attached to the aircraft. I'm gonna go ahead and finish up the other one, and then we'll move on to the next step. Quick reminder guys, if you have not painted or done anything to the trailing edge of your aircraft, now would be a good time to either apply some Plasti-dip or laminate the back half. That way the tape hinge has something to stick to. So what I'm gonna do is start off with a few strips of tape as a guide. So I'm just gonna take a small 1 by 1.5 inch sheet of tape. I'm gonna line up my Elevon. I'm gonna keep the Elevon towards the outside as much as possible. So what I wanna do is line up the Elevon to the tip of the wing with very little bit of space and leaving myself a little bit of a gap here in the back. You want to make sure this has enough play and it doesn't bind against the vertical stabilizers. So first thing I like to do is place them down. You want to make sure there's no lip here. There's no drop or there's no raise between the elevon and the surface. And we're just going to put a little piece of tape right here to tack that into place. I'm going to do the same thing on the outer tip. And now we've got the basis of our elevon hinge. Okay guys, now there's a new technique that Chris showed me how to make the hinges a lot tighter. What I'm going to do is cut off small strips of tape about 3/4 of an inch to about an inch wide. I'm going to cut those pieces of tape in half here, and then what I do is I take both pieces and I flip them backwards, so I basically stick them to each other. That will give you a sticky side up and a sticky side down. Then what we're going to do is we're going to take that piece and we're going to slide it through the gap between the elevon and the actual wing. This part can be a little bit tricky, so make sure you guys use a lot of patience. Once you get it through, what you want to do is you want to pull it down nice and flush so that you can attach the tape on the sticky side to either the wing or the elevon. And while I'm doing this, I'm applying a little bit of pressure against the elevon to the back of the wing. And as you can see, I've got the sticky side down on the actual wing this time, and the other end of the sticky side going to the elevon. This helps create a nice tight seam between the elevon and the wing. So what I'm going to do here is go ahead and cut out several pieces of these hinges that Chris showed me how to do, and we're going to slide this in between the pieces of tape that we use to start our baseline. So I'm going to put one on each side of that starter tape. Again, this is a little bit tricky, so just take your time feeding them through. And once you get them through, what I like to do is do one hinge facing the elevon and one hinge facing the wing, as you'll see here shortly. Okay, so we're going to do the same thing here in the middle, and I'm going to do probably about 3 of them here in the middle. I'm going to do one facing towards the elevon, one facing towards the wing, and then one facing towards the elevon. So we'll just slide them through. You can also do the outside parts as well. The more of these you put on there in key locations like the outermost points and the inner points, the stronger and the tighter your hinge will be. So you can see I'm trying to feed it through the gap between the elevon and the hinge here.
So as you guys can see, once you've done about 3 or 4 of them in key locations, going inside and outside of the elevon and on the wing, you'll notice you'll get a very nice tight hinge here, very little bit of light, very little bit of gap. You'll also notice that it's connected really nice and smooth along the top of the wing.
Now to seal that deal in, what I'm going to do is just take a nice long strip of tape here. And this part is always done a little bit easier if you have a friend or somebody helping you out, but if you don't, what I like to do is line this up nice and evenly on the hinge line. Tack down the tape towards the back and roll it back. Make sure it's stuck nice and tight. Then I'm going to push the elevon down, as you can see it in the down position, and then roll it over the top. Trying to avoid any wrinkles. And then I'm going to take my razor and trim all the excess. All right, now that our hinge is done there, what I'm going to do is flip it over, and I'm going to put another piece of tape over this seam right here, and that will solidify this seam, and this elevon is not coming off. This is the part where having a friend or somebody help you would make life a lot easier. Can I get a friend?
You can get a friend. All right.
We're going to just seam that up. All right. So as your friend holds it nice and tight against the fuse, we're going to try to eliminate any kind of seams here in the middle.
Which end do you want to start at?
We'll start on the plain side first.
Because I can squeeze it as you go.
So we've got this part nice and stuck. And then we're going to just take it from the middle here and just roll the edges out. All right. And now we've got a nice, beautiful hinge, nice and tight. There's no gaps, you can't see any light through there. There's no steps, it's all nice and flush. All that's left now is to attach our control horn and our control rods. I'm gonna go ahead and finish up this elevon and we'll move on to the next step. All right guys, once we have our elevons attached, now we're gonna go ahead and link up our servos to the actual elevons. If you picked up the carbon fiber rod kit for the mini Drak, then you're gonna have these components in front of you. The first thing I wanna do is I'm going to trim down these control rods because they come in one size and it's just a lot easier to ship them out in this size. What I'm gonna do real quick is take a pair of dikes and just cut them at an angle here, and you'll see why in just a moment. So as you can see, I just shortened it down. I've got plenty of slack still left in the actual rod, but the reason I cut this down at an angle is because I'm going to use this side right here to drive these screws into the balsa elevon. So you want to do is take these brass clevises and just make sure they fit into the servo holes. They're going to fit a little tight, but once you get them in, you'll get the idea. If you need to make the hole a little bit bigger, what you could do is you could use a lighter and heat up the end of this rod that we just cut off and just slip it in there and make that hole just a little bit bigger. However, I'm not going to do that right now. I can do that later on if I need to. Then what you're going to do is you're going to want to line up the rod to the actual servo. So now we have this lined up in a straight line right here. We're going to take our Dubro control horns and we're gonna kind of dry fit them and just mount them where a good spot would be. Make sure that this lines up with the wing, inner side of the wing, and the actual servo line. The elevon moves in about a 45-degree angle from the actual servo movement. That's why there's these ball joints included. They will take up any of that extra slack. All right, so what you want to do is you want to take this brass clevis and you want to put it on the actual servo arm itself. And then if you take a pair of pliers, you could actually just force it right in to where it's not going to come off. As you can see, I've got it in there and I've got some movement. It's not very fluid, but it works. And actually on this aircraft, you don't want a lot of movement. Next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the control horn and I'm going to install the rod. Now, you could go through and thread this on there, or you can make your life a little bit easier is take that little piece that we just cut off. If you heat it up, you can actually slip it in there and make that hole just a little bit bigger so you don't get any slop. Now we're going to take the ball joint and we're going to drive the screw into the hole that we just widened a little bit. As you see, it'll thread in. Next, we're going to take the bolt and bolt in the backside. I would recommend after you've done all your maiden flight and tuning flights and everything to go ahead and put a little bit of Loctite on the back of this, just as a safety precaution. Now what I'm going to do is just make sure that I line the rod up to the actual servo movement, and it should be parallel to the inner side of the wing. We're going to get our spacing and our idea of exactly where it's going to go. I did move the control horn just back a little bit because if you remember, we have a little beveled edge in the bottom here and I don't want to drive the screw through that. So once you've got it lined up approximately where you want it to be, and in my case this is pretty healthy, I've got enough meat on the elevon, you're going to go ahead and take that little rod that we cut off, and I'm going to make a dimple in the balsa. So now that I have a guide to about where they're going to go, you can actually use this little bit of control rod to make your holes for your screws that are going to hold a control horn in place. This balsa is very soft, so you don't have to really do much work. Just a little bit of a spin and then a pop, and it comes out the bottom nice and smooth. Now we can go ahead and take our screws, drive them in, and then we're going to take the back plate off and drive that in with the screws. So now that we've got all that lined up, we're going to drive these screws in. This balsa is very soft, so you don't have to drive it in too far. What I always like to do is just drive it in to the point where I feel that the plastic is starting to dimple into the balsa, and then that should be a good enough indication to stop. And as you can see, it kind of recesses into the balsa there. I'm going to cut this right about here, giving myself plenty of room to slide in or out if I need to make any adjustments later. So we'll go ahead and cut that. And then you should be able to now slide this in. Raise my servo arm completely up. And that should be about there. So now we're going to head over to the soldering station and we're going to actually solder this in. All right, when soldering these parts together, it helps to have a friend hold the elevon in the position that you want it, and then also grab a wet paper towel and hold that against the back of the clevis. That way you don't melt the control horn on the servo. And this should be a quick task.
A good side note is that if you're not using like a good rosin core solder, you're going to want to add extra flux because this step definitely requires a lot of flux.
So now that that's dry, we've got a solid linkage from our servo to our elevon. The only thing left to do is take the heat shrink and slip it over the clevis and the carbon fiber rod and heat this up to get a nice solid control link. I'm going to go ahead and do the other side as well. Alright guys, at this point the wings are now complete. The only thing left to do is glue on our winglets, and we can do that at the very end after we finished assembling the aircraft. A little side note, if you guys want to add a little bit extra, you can take your Dremel cutting tool, again using the wet paper towel, and cut these excess screws off if you like. Sometimes it helps, sometimes it doesn't. If you transport your aircrafts, they'll tend to bang around and hit those. But if it's not a major issue for you, then I wouldn't worry about it. Alright guys, last few steps is installing the motor and the little plugs that hold the caps on. So I'm going to go ahead and do that real quick. These IKEA plug caps are really easy to install. As you can see, there is a hex pattern in there, and all you do is take an Allen key and just pretty much drive them right in. You could put a little bit of goop if you like in there if you're worried about them coming out. I've never had a problem with that, but all I do is just take them and drive them into the designated spots, and they hold pretty good. And you want to drive them down in there nice and flush. Alright, now to install the motor mount, it's pretty straightforward. It's very simple to do. We're going to use the included hex bolts. Now the great thing about this motor mount is, depending on your CG, you can run the L bracket inwards like this to run the motor in as far as forward as possible, or you can flip it and run it like this to have the motor stick out a little farther if you need more room for the weight. I'm going to try to keep this a light and peppy aircraft, so what I'm going to do is install my motor up here in the front like this, and you'll see that the motor will just slide right in. And I'm actually going to mount it to the back holes here. That way the prop has plenty of clearance to grab nice fresh air. Before you tighten down the bolts, you want to make sure that the motor mount sits completely level and squared inside the mount itself. You want to make sure that it spins freely without binding or touching any of the sides. Got a very, very tight tolerance here on the edges. Also, to make sure to look through the motor and make sure that the bolts are not going through and touching the coils inside. These actually work pretty good. There's plenty of separation between the bolts and the actual motor wires. Alright, and lastly, we're going to take the included bolts and literally just drive them through. Alright guys, at this point, the only things left for you guys to do at home is glue on your winglets. I've gone ahead and glued them on already. I'm just using hot glue. You want to make sure that the winglets are lined up with the wing tip. You don't want them protruding forward or backwards, so you want them just lined up perfectly here. You want to balance the amount that's on top and the bottom as well. So I've already gone and done that. And the other thing you want to do is hot glue down the included Velcro. This will hold your wings together. A lot of guys saying maybe that the Velcro is not strong enough. When you're flying this aircraft, there isn't a lot of lateral pull. It's mostly horizontal pull, pulling back. So you shouldn't have to worry about the wings coming off or anything like that. And lastly, you'll want to go ahead and glue down your bay lid covers for the front and the back. What I always like to do too is, when you do glue these down, you'll want to go through and slice a hinge right along the coroplast, so when you glue this down, you have a way to open and close it to get into all your gear. We've already got our motor installed. Just going back over here to show you guys, I've got the ESC placed inside. And the ESC, I haven't finished soldering it yet, which I will do shortly. The wires on the motor and the ESC are quite long, so I would utilize that and place the ESC somewhere where it helps out with your CG, so you don't have to add dead weight. If you feel that it's too tail heavy, move it forward. If you feel that it's too nose heavy, go ahead and move it back. Also, the included bay lids that you guys will be getting will have vents in the front and the back to get that nice cooling in there with that ESC. Alright guys, so that concludes the mini Drak build for the actual aircraft. At this point, you should be ready to maiden your aircraft minus any FPV gear. Stay tuned for the second part of this video where we install all of our FPV gear. I'm going to be using the RunCam camera up front, and I'll be using a Dragon Link receiver and a micro vector. I'll show you guys how to solder and where all the different components go. So don't forget to click subscribe so you don't miss out on that and stay up to date with the latest and greatest in FPV. If you guys like watching these build videos and they help you out, don't forget to click the like button. That directly correlates to our ego and making sure that we keep bringing you guys these build videos. With Team Legit, I'm Johnny. Thanks for watching.